Now that we've upgraded to version 5.08 from 5.07, let's discuss some of the features with this latest incarnation of Debian, Deb6x. So we'll label this section Deb6x features. Features largely mirror version 5x, but of course there are new capabilities that are worth mentioning. So the current release is 6.01, which is subject to change depending on when you use this material, but nonetheless the major version is version 6. So major version 6x, and its code name, and this is useful when you're searching for packages or support online with respect to this release, is called squeeze. And you can ascertain this information by catting the contents of etc Debian version. For our particular release, it's still the release prior to squeeze, so it won't show it. However, nonetheless, in essence, you cat etc Debian version to ascertain that particular version, which correlates to a particular release name. So codename squeeze. Now, with respect to versioning, the Debian project arranges 3 maintenance streams at least at all times. So maintains 3 streams / branches of the OS. And they include the stable, which you should run on production systems. And this currently is named squeeze, or version 6x, 6.01 currently. Additionally, there is the unstable, and unstable is referenced as SID. And then there's also in between stable and unstable, which represent the opposite ends of the spectrum. And that will be testing. So testing is in between stable and unstable branches. And the importance of understanding the 3 main streams surround a number of issues, including but not limited to the ability to derive packages from either or all of the branches as they are applicable to your environment. So for example, some applications may be available in the testing or unstable stream, but not available in the stable stream. And if you configure your app sources accordingly, you'll be able to take advantage of those packages. So there are 3 streams at all times, and this goes for older versions, including our current version 5.08. Now, this is a fully open source operating system, and it's largely GNU Linux based. But this is slowly but surely, or maybe rapidly but surely, changing. It's fully open source in that the components that are included with the operating system under the main branch of etc apt sources.list are entirely free. So when we cat the contents of etc apt sources.list, we see a number of pointers. However, here's one for Handbrake, which helps us with multimedia conversions. But taking a look at this particular entry, for example, Deb, HTTP, so on and so forth, to the website, to the mirror. And let's copy and paste this and just discuss quickly what a reference to a fully open source operating system means. So when apt or aptitude references mirrors.kernel.org as our mirror, or your mirror, whatever the mirror may be, it may be an internal mirror, an external mirror, or otherwise, it points to a particular distribution. We're currently running Lenny. We're about to upgrade. And it also references 2 directories from the particular mirror. One is main, one is contrib. There are also other directories that can be specified, such as non-free, for example. All of the programs that are found beneath main are considered fully open source, fully free software. The contrib packages, however, are a mixture of open source and other more restrictive licenses, and non-free or non-free programs that may be included by commercial vendors. So for the most part, the programs that are included with Debian, unlike other Linux distributions, are actually free. and that makes it fully open source. And you may elect to incorporate as part of your operating system distribution other packages that are partially free, contrib, or not free, non-free. So let's just note that in these directories you'll find, for example, in the mirrors, that is, you'll find main, free packages, contrib, contributed by others, partially free, and or with rather restrictive licenses as opposed to the main packages, and non-free. These are commercial packages. And all you need to do is take a look at one of the mirrors to see these directories as they're made available. So for example, with Debian 508, you navigate into Debian 508, there's main, there's contrib, there's non-free commercial packages, and for all of the supported platforms, we see the various directories. These are the platforms, which leads us into another feature of Debian, is that it supports a wide range of platforms. So you can install Debian on a variety of hardware platforms, from AMD to Intel to MIPS to PowerPC to S390 to Spark and otherwise. And as platforms come and go, Debian's tree will be made available accordingly. And there are some platforms that have been deprecated in this particular release, but of course we tend to focus on the more commonplace platforms, i386 and Intel 64. So those are your three branches, and they are largely main, contrib, and non-free that you will find that Debian largely references. So 3 branches, and in addition to 3 branches, different ways of incorporating packages into your stream. Now that brings us to the fact that it supports numerous hardware architectures / platforms. No need to list all of them. The common ones, of course, include, but not limit to i386, IA64, AMD 64, Spark, S390, etc. A number of platforms are supported. So you can install Debian with as small a footprint as 20 megabytes and as large as several gigabytes as a consequence of its flexibility. Now, in addition to the numerous platforms that are supported, currently over 29,000 packages are supported or provided with the distribution, which is why it grows with each successive release. In the last edition, which is 5X, Lenny, we mentioned that over 18,000 packages were included. Currently that number is just under 30,000. We'll restart Firefox later. An update has been published since our last session. So that is the case with respect to the number of packages that are included. Now, another exciting feature that's provided with this release is the fact that there is testing or experimental support. So it's normally called a feature test, if you will, of the FreeBSD kernel or GNU userland. That's an important feature included with Debian 6X. Largely, Debian has been based on the GNU Linux kernel, so the kernel that's taken over the whole free software movement. However, FreeBSD has been out there. All of the BSD strains have been out there, led largely by FreeBSD. And Debian, since it is largely a GNU project which uses the Linux kernel, is not relegated solely to the Linux kernel to operate the hardware to which it controls or is attached. So there is now experimental support. It's not fully production, but it is included with this release of Debian 6X, whereby you may use the FreeBSD kernel as opposed to the Linux kernel via GNU userland. So you'll be able to set up a full GNU Debian system which uses the FreeBSD kernel. And the branch of this particular release is called KFreeBSD and your particular architecture. So it's known as KFreeBSD, the K standing for kernel. So if you'd like to experiment, for example, with the FreeBSD kernel, then that is something you will want to look into on the Debian website with respect to the version to download. Notice you didn't see it for version 5.08, but for 6.01, which is the current release, we see the KFreeBSD, for example, for two platforms here, AMD 64 and i386. So slowly but surely the kernel of FreeBSD is making its way into the Debian tree, which means you'll have options. So for those of you who have a penchant for FreeBSD, myself included, due to its stability, legacy, longevity, and so on, this is an option for you to consider. Now, this feature test is officially labeled a technology by many vendors, but in this case, since it's specific to Debian, a technology preview. And as with prior versions, this particular release supports graphical and text-based installations. Now, another thing we should mention is that new in this particular release is the ability to set up different types of partitions during installation, which other distributions like SUSE and Red Hat support, but Debian now supports RAID, logical volume management, and crypto file systems are now supported during installation. So you can set up your LVM from the start without having to rely upon either a conversion subsequent to installation or relying upon using a non-LVM or RAID type partition during installation for the root file system, for the bare root file system anyway. Now, Debian can be downloaded, so it's downloadable, of course. You may also order disks if you'd like, but you may use the standard protocols as we've seen before, including but not limited to HTTP, FTP, BitTorrent, Jigsaw download, like the previous version, so that hasn't changed, same feature set as before. So these are ways in which you may obtain the Debian sources. Now, of course, the sources are rather large. It's now currently available in roughly 8 DVDs. So 8 times roughly 4 gigs, that's 32 to 37 or so gigs worth of content, at least for the i386 platform. So it's rather large. And on the Debian website, you can get a sense for the various footprints for various versions. Just like before, it's installable from a variety of sources, including but not limited to local media, which means CDs, DVDs, USB sticks, and other types of local media that your system can boot from. For example, compact flash if your system supports it, like a laptop, for example. Of course, you may install from the network, which is where we place the bulk of our emphasis. So network-based installation, and in this case we use either the net install images or Pixie installation. We'll be using Pixie. It's easier to set up. We have our TFTP server already in place, the current server that we're logged into, so we'll just set that environment up and then install a separate instance from it. Graphically speaking, so desktop environments, this release supports GNOME as well as KDE and others. But the major desktop environments, of course, are GNOME and KDE. So with GNOME being the default. You get your typical graphical applications for productivity, such as OpenOffice, which comes as no surprise. Virtually all distributions include it nowadays. You have a full-fledged package manager in Aptitude, as well as apt, the whole apt series of tools, such as apt-get, for example, to manage your packages, as well as distribution updates. And in this particular release, you can use apt-get to perform a distribution update. So distribution upgrade, or should be, performed using apt-get in this release. Whereas in the Lenny release, the suggestion was to use aptitude. So it seemed to oscillate between versions. Now, another important feature that's released with this version is the usage of Grub version 2. Grub version 2 is the latest incarnation of the Grub or Grand Unified Bootloader. When you upgrade your system, as we will, Grub version 2 will be chain loaded initially, as would be the case if you dual booted between Linux, GNU, Debian, and let's say Windows, for example. So initially Grub 2 is chain loaded and can be upgraded to the default bootloader that isn't chain loaded but rather resides in the MBR, massive boot record, 512 bytes of your system. So it's chain loaded initially, and let's just put a note that you will use the upgrade from grub legacy command once you know it's working. This is just to ensure that version 2 works on your system without any hitch. So we execute this once it is indeed functional. Now, we've yet to discuss system requirements. They haven't changed much since the prior version. As we've come to expect with operating systems nowadays, the more the merrier. So the more resources you have, the better. But let's just list some of the important system requirements so that you are sure to have the appropriate hardware, which you will given these paltry specs. So you should have a 1 gigahertz P4 processor, or better, of course. You need at least 256 megs of memory. And if you intend to run Debian Sans desktop, you should have a minimum of 1 gigabyte of storage. Now, for various platforms, you can get away with as little as 20 megabytes. However, for standard x86-based systems, 64-bit and 32-bit alike, you need about a gig or more. And this is, of course, Sans desktop. So, a text-based server, for example, which runs perhaps the LAMP stack in the background, would work well with a gig of storage, quarter gig of memory. But of course, the more the merrier. Now, if you'd like to use a desktop, you should plan on having at least, and this, of course, the 256 is Sans desktop as well. So let's just note that. So Sans desktop. And if you plan to use a desktop, you should have 512 megs of memory and up to 5 gigabytes of storage. This, of course, is with the desktop environment. Of course, the more the merrier. The more memory you feed to your applications like the LAMP stack, Apache, MySQL, PHP, for example, the faster your scripts, databases, and web services will perform. So, these are the paltry specs that are required. Not much more required to get Debian up and running, but if you'd like to benefit from high performance, of course, get multiple cores, dual, quad, so on and so forth, and as much memory as you can afford. So these are the system requirements, and to be sure that those requirements are met before we upgrade the system, let's just navigate to the shell, and let's df-h. It's a simple task for us. df shows us the utilization of the various mount points. So the root file system in our case is an LVM managed volume. This volume is 144 gigs, of which 21 gigs are free. Now, since the bulk of the programs associated with version 6X will be copied to the root file system, we need to ensure that at least 5 gigabytes are free, and we've met that requirement. So it's a simple task. Confirm system requirements. So one way to do it is to execute a df-h. You can do it explicitly against the root file system, but without the root file system, we'll show you the full layout, which may include a spread of other mount points such as var, user, so on and so forth. In our case, you can see that that isn't the case. So ostensibly, user, var, so on and so forth are stored within the root file system. There are other mount points such as LCBT, which we use as a storage repository for media, ISO images, and otherwise. And here, for example, we see a mount of the first DVD of Debian 6.01, but without specific mount points for var user home, for example, you know that those particular mount points or directories are included as part of the root file system. So there are 21 gigs to go around for all of those purposes. But again, a df-h / would focus exclusively on the root file system, which is an LVM managed volume. We can tell that it's LVM because it's beneath the tree dev mapper, and it has a name within dev mapper that tells us that it's LVM. But you can also confirm whether or not it's LVM by grepping, let's say for example, LCBT win1-root from etcfs tab, which should show the details surrounding this particular mount item. It's mounted as ext3. LVM-based volumes are instantiated as a supported file system type such as ext3, 4, or rise or otherwise. That brings us to one other point that would have slipped us, which would have come up at some other point, and that is that ext4 is now supported by default. So it isn't an addition that is enabled outside of the installation process. It's the default file system type. So ostensibly this system was set up when ext3 was the default, which is why it is an ext3 base volume. Now, lvdisplay is the LVM command that would display or will display the different logical volume management volumes or volumes that are managed by LVM. Here is the LCBT win1 root volume. This is the 144 roughly gigs that is exposed as the root file system. So lvdisplay. Let's just note lvdisplay to enumerate LVM managed root file system, or FS. So we do have the storage, 5 gigs or more of storage available. Now insofar as RAM is concerned, if we execute a freem, we'll see that it has 3 gigs. And that tells us that we meet the memory standard. So B free M returns memory information. And our system has 3 gigabytes of RAM, which exceeds the 512 megs that are required for a full desktop environment. So memory is intact, storage is intact. How about the CPU? Well, to figure out the CPU, we can cat proc CPU info, and this will reveal the number of processors, if more than one, the speed, the cache on the processor. In this case, it's a 1 meg cache processor. So it's a P4 operating at 2.8 gigahertz. And there appears to be one processor. Notice it reads CPU cores 1. Now, P4 processors support hyperthreading. So hyperthreading in this instance could be disabled. If enabled, it would give us a boost in performance. So C, cat from the virtual file system proc CPU info. And this returns active CPU information. In our case, that information returns that it's an Intel P4 to 8 gigahertz with 1 core. Again, hyperthreading may be disabled. The BIOS could be checked to help rectify it. So insofar as storage, memory, and processing power are concerned, we've met the specs. These are the 3 areas of concern for any computer, and that is settled. So thus far we've covered the main features of this release of Debian 6x. We know that we have the requirements necessary, so the next task for us is to upgrade the system.